Tonight on KQED Newsroom, in the wake of increased hate crimes against Asian Americans, several California leaders are urging Governor Newsom to appoint an Asian American as the state's next Attorney General. And Assemblymember Buffy Wicks talks about managing motherhood and work in the time of COVID, plus her goals for her next years in office. And tiny homes in Oakland, built for young people who need shelter, are in the spotlight as this week's look at something beautiful. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. All eyes have been on the rise in violence against Asian Americans this week as traumatic images have filled our screens. Yesterday, Asian American Congress members testified about the rise in violence against their community over the past year. The hearing took place in the wake of a mass shooting that claimed the lives of several Asian American women in Georgia. Now that California's former Attorney General, Javier Becerra, has been confirmed, narrowly, as the nation's new Director of Health and Human Services, Governor Newsom will appoint his successor. Several California lawmakers are urging Newsom to put someone of Asian descent in that seat, in part to combat this disturbing rise in violence. So to discuss the week's big political stories, I'm joined now by KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos, who joins me by Skype from San Francisco. Hello, Marisa.
Hey, Priya. Thanks for having me.
And from Mountain View by Skype is Lanhee Chen, a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Hi, Lanhee.
Hi, Priya. Thank you.
So Filipino Assemblymember Rob Bonta's name is at the top of some lists to become the next state attorney general. Marisa, the rise in violence against Asian Americans, which has been linked to the pandemic, has still been on the radar here in California for many months. So what's being done at the state level to stop that violence?
Yeah, I mean, California already has some pretty strong hate crime laws on its books, which is, of course, not a preventative measure anyway. I think what we're really seeing is state leaders led by the AAPI community, but also involving, a wide kind of swath of different folks, really speaking out, using the megaphone they have to talk about these horrific attacks, not just in Atlanta, but we've seen just in recent days in San Francisco, elderly Asian Americans attacked in really just traumatizing events. And so I think that this is giving kind of some momentum to this push that you mentioned that's existed for weeks around somebody like Rob Bonta. He is Filipino American, is an Oakland Assembly member. He's a progressive, and I think that a lot of people see that this would be the moment to put someone like that in this role, both for the symbolism of having an Asian American as the top law enforcement officer, but also because there's a lot that they can actually do in that position, using not just the megaphone, but the power of the law. So I would expect that this might be something that would be kind of weighing on the governor as he decides that appointment. And I think we've also seen another sign this week, Priya, which is that Newsom basically promised on national TV that if Dianne Feinstein were to step down, he would put a black woman into that role. Kamala Harris was, of course, the only black woman in the Senate when she left for the vice presidency. And so I think that also adds some sort of weight to the idea that this might be a really important AAPI appointment.
So we'll get back to that in a moment as well. Lanhee, we often think of increased diversity as part of the Democratic Party agenda, but Republicans really made significant inroads in Asian American representation in Southern California in this past election. So can you tell us about some new Asian American members of Congress and what that tells you about California's demographics?
Well, it was a path-breaking election in the sense that you had two Korean-American Republican women elected to Congress from Orange County. One, Young Kim, represents a district that's about a third Asian. Another is Michelle Steele. She represents a district there that's coastal in Orange County that's about 20% Asian. So it was a breakthrough. I think it's important. Representation matters, Priya. I think it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I think if you're Asian American and you see what's been happening recently, you see the violence and the hatred, it's important for leaders to speak up, regardless of what their racial or ethnic background might be. But the notion of having Asian American leadership in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, I think it's something that's crucially important during this time when we confront these really challenging issues facing the Asian American community.
Do you expect, Lanhee, to see more Asian American candidates rise up in the Republican Party?
I certainly hope so. I mean, I think there's an important message to be sent in terms of that representation. I also think just for the Republican Party, it is an opportunity to speak to a population that I think, frankly, has been taken for granted politically by both Democrats and Republicans historically. So I think part of that exercise is ensuring there are strong Asian American leaders in the Republican Party throughout the state who are willing to step up, whether it's for local elections or for congressional elections or for statewide elections. I think it's crucially important that the Asian American community sees that representation and understands that there is a potential for them to have a home in the Republican Party. So yeah, I do expect that to be a big part of the effort going forward here as we move toward elections in 2022 and beyond.
Thanks for that insight. And Marisa, let's turn to the latest on the recall effort. You had an exclusive interview with Governor Newsom recently, which people can find on your Twitter feed or mine if they'd like to hear it. This week, he faced the recall head-on for the first time. What's he saying about it?
Yeah, I mean, he really laid out in that interview a week ago with me, I think, the kind of plan that Democrats are going to be following in the weeks ahead as they wait to see if this indeed qualifies. He's talking, I mean, they're branding this the Republican recall. They're really trying to tie this effort to far-right groups, to former President Donald Trump, to these divisive issues that, quite frankly, when you just look at the straight-up registration numbers in California, could actually help Democrats defeat this because of the fact that there's so many more of them than Republicans. So I think that Newsom is really trying to frame this as not just an attack on him, but on the Democratic Party, on the progressive policies that he has, tried to promote. He's talked about immigration, about just the diversity of California. And I think that he's really trying to lean in to making this a referendum, not on him as much, but on the Republicans about what they're trying to bring to the table.
Marisa, when you talk about the breakdown of voters in this country, we do have about double the number of Democrats as Republicans. But there are as many, people who say that they are no party preference as Republicans. And I'm curious, Lanhee, if you see this recall as strictly a partisan effort or if it's representative of a broader dissatisfaction with Governor Newsom's response to the pandemic, and if perhaps some of those people in that no party preference category might be enticed to vote in favor of a recall.
Yeah, I do think as you look at this recall effort, it is clearly broader than just a Republican-only effort. I think the governor risks looking out of touch with those who are not Republicans. In fact, the 1 in 3 who signed petitions who are either of no party preference or who are Democrats, who say, look, they're dissatisfied with the governor's handling of the pandemic. This is not about the cultural issues. It's not about climate change. It's not about the kinds of things that you would typically expect divide Republicans and Democrats. This recall, it seems to me, is premised on the governor's handling of the pandemic, some of the issues around, for example, vaccine distribution, schools still being closed, of course, the massive unemployment insurance scandal. Those are all things that I think animate voters, and they're not Republican issues. They're issues, in fact, that voters look at and they say, I think we have a mismanagement problem in California. So the governor does really risk, I think, looking disassociated from reality the more he pushes this notion that it's just a Republican recall.
Marisa, what would you say to that? And could you also take us through the timeline for this recall, which looks like it probably will qualify?
Yeah, I mean, Lanhee's right. There's always political risk in any tactic. I mean, I think what Democrats are banking on is a few things here. One is just the numbers you laid out and the fact that no party preference voters do tend to kind of skew one way or the other. And so it's not as if I don't think that entire universe of no party preference is necessarily up for grabs for either party. The other thing is, I think the recall backers are going to have to be careful because a lot of the people that initiated this effort and helped them collect these signatures do have ties to far-right groups, do have anti-immigrant statements in their past, things that obviously does not represent every single Californian that maybe signed those petitions. But those are the things that Democrats are trying to really lean into and talk about. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the recall itself, that campaign, tries to either distance itself from some of those elements or bring them into the fold in the coming weeks. Because I do think that could give some kind of fuel to the fire on the side of Democrats if they lean into that. In terms of timeline, we're expecting that we might know in the next month or so whether there's enough valid signatures. We expect that by this summer they would be setting a date, probably in the fall, probably November, and that there would be a deadline of this summer for folks getting on that recall ballot. And I think that is actually the key question right now, is not how does either side act in the next few months, but how does Newsom act? How does he govern, right? if there are enough shots in arms, if kids are going back to school, if the COVID crisis feels like it's moving behind us, I don't think he feels as vulnerable. And that means that it's less likely that either a moderate Democrat or even more moderate Republicans jump into the race. And that's going to be the challenge for Republicans, too, is make sure this doesn't just become like a circular firing squad in the coming months. They want to keep their attention focused on Newsom. But the better the state does, and we're doing pretty well right now, I think the harder that becomes for them.
Well, moving away from the recall, Lanhee, you wrote this week about the fact that for the last 15 years, we have had Democrats in power in California, and you have argued that this has led to problems in governance. Could you talk us through what your concerns are?
Well, I think it's a question of accountability, Priya, and really who is there to hold leaders accountable. I think what having checks and balances in government does is it forces politicians, regardless of party, to be accountable. And by the way, you can look to one-party governance in states where it's all Republicans in charge and identify similar kinds of problems. But the issue really comes back to mismanagement. I think a lot of what we're seeing with respect to Governor Newsom's performance, the seeds for that were sown long ago. You know, for example, the Employment Development Department, which runs the unemployment insurance program in California, the fact that they weren't prepared to handle the influx of cases during the pandemic, that's directly a function of the fact that there really hasn't been an effort to hold leaders accountable for too long. So in my mind, it's about how we create accountability, how we create the kinds of checks and balances that were intended for our state to be governed better and for outcomes for all of California citizens to be better as well. And I think it's all a function of having an environment where there's no accountability.
All right. Well, I want to go now to that comment, Marisa, that you mentioned earlier. Governor Newsom did say this week he's going to appoint a black woman to fill Senator Dianne Feinstein's seat should she choose to step down rather than serve out the remaining 4 years of her current term. To which it seems Senator Feinstein basically responded, "Quit? Who's quitting? Not this 87-year-old." So what is going on here, and does it seem likely that she will serve out her term?
I think the jury is still out. As you noted, she is 87. She has several more years on her term. I think that, you know, circumstances could change. We've already seen to some extent the fact that Dianne Feinstein is being almost sidelined within the Democratic Party, right? She faced her first real challenge, which she did handily beat back, but in another Democrat several years ago when she ran, she stepped down as head of the Judiciary Committee instead of kind of facing an insurrection among her own members, especially on the left wing of the party, who feels like she has been not a good sort of partisan soldier in a time where Congress is so divided. Got a lot of grief when she hugged Lindsey Graham without a mask on after the Supreme Court hearings. And so I think that Feinstein is really at a point where a lot of people are pushing back, but she has made clear, you know, she's going to do this on her terms. And I think Newsom is trying to walk this fine line here because she is a mentor to him. He doesn't want to be seen as pushing her out, but I think he did want to kind of send that message that he does see her replacement as an opportunity for not just Black Californians, but I think Black Americans to sort of reclaim the seat that they lost when Kamala Harris left the Senate.
All right. And Lanhee, I'm going to give you this last question here. California's new senator, Alex Padilla, gave his first speech on the Senate floor this week. He's tackling immigration, and he is seeking a pathway to citizenship for 5 million unauthorized immigrants who are also essential workers. What are your thoughts on his chances of success with this very thorny issue?
Well, the immigration issue has gotten no less polarized over the last couple of years, and certainly with some of the challenges we're seeing at the southern border now, I think it's a difficult time for immigration reform to get across the finish line. I think there are elements of immigration reform that could garner bipartisan support, but this really thorny question of what to do with those who are in the United States with undocumented status, that one is quite politically divisive, unfortunately. I think it's an important issue that needs to get resolved, but it's one that I don't anticipate there being a lot of political consensus around anytime soon.
All right, Lanhee, Chen with the Hoover Institution, Marisa Lagos with KQED. Thank you both for your insight and your analysis.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you.
Our next guest is no stranger to the rough and tumble of politics. After several years of working behind the scenes for President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, she won her own political office in 2018 as a member of the California State Assembly. Buffy Jo Christina Wicks represents California's 15th district, which includes Berkeley, Richmond, and parts of Oakland. She's also the mother of two, who had a viral moment last year when she appeared on the floor of the Assembly with her newborn baby, who she had to bring to work with her after being denied the right to vote by proxy. Wicks recently released her planned bills for 2021, which focus on providing more protections for parents, housing reform, and justice for victims of sexual assault by police officers. Joining me now by Skype from Oakland is State Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. Assemblymember Wicks, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and you can call me Buffy.
All right, well then, Buffy, let's start at the beginning of your story. Tell us a little bit about the environment you grew up in.
Sure. So I actually grew up in rural California, a little town called Forest Hill, which is in between San Francisco and Lake Tahoe on I-80. A couple thousand people, very politically conservative, but good, hardworking people, and small school, small environment. You kind of knew everyone in the town.
And how did you move from sort of that conservative background into grassroots campaigning for Democratic candidates?
Well, I actually went to community college. I went to Sierra College in Rockland. And one of my political science professors there said, you should really volunteer on a campaign. And I thought, sure. So I volunteered on my first congressional race in 1996 for a woman named Katie Herning, who's running against John Doolittle. And we lost terribly, but I fell in love with organizing. I fell in love with politics and campaigns and decided this is what I wanted to do, even though I didn't know that could actually be a thing. And so I just stayed very involved. I worked on the Hill after college, and I ended up back in the Bay Area doing anti-war organizing during the Iraq War in 2003, 2002, 2003, and then worked for Howard Dean in Iowa. And that set me on a whole different trajectory in national politics, and ended up working for Barack Obama for 6 years.
And do you have any behind-the-scenes stories that you could share with us about your time with the President Barack Obama or with Hillary Clinton?
Well, having worked for both of them and staffed both of them, they're just super talented, smart, hardworking, caring people. They, are all in it to help people, truthfully. When you think about, President Obama, you think about his relationship with the First Lady Michelle. I mean, they're genuinely affectionate, sweet, caring people. They raised good daughters. They're just good people. And it was quite an experience. I was I think employee number 32 on the Barack Obama campaign. I moved to Chicago in March of 2007. And that was when Hillary was definitely going to be the nominee, and no one thought, a black man named Barack Hussein Obama could be the president of the United States. And I just sort of rode this wild ride. I think he spoke to the country at that time in a very compelling way. I came back here to be the field director in California, in my home state, which was great. But it was an exciting time. I look back at that time. I was, I think, 31 when I worked in the White House, and I was old enough to have real responsibility, but young enough where I didn't have family, and I could just dive all in on working for the president, working on the Affordable Care Act, on a number of really important issues, and it was a very pivotal, sort of magical time for me in my career.
And did you have in the back of your mind that you wanted to run for office at some point? I'm curious sort of if your decision to work for others was a strategic one so that you could learn, so you could someday do the same thing, or if you really didn't see yourself in political leadership.
For the longest time, I never saw myself as someone who actually could be an elected official. I just saw myself as someone who could work for them and work for people that I believed in. And it wasn't until recently that I thought, well, maybe I could do this. I just felt of myself as sort of a behind-the-scenes person. And then when the 2016 campaign happened, I was actually pregnant during 2016, and my daughter was actually due Election Day, and I thought she was going to be born the day we, elected our first woman president. And obviously that didn't happen. My daughter was late 2 weeks. I sort of call it her first act of civil disobedience. She was like, I'm not coming out into the world. You guys just elected Donald Trump, But it was very thinking through, what do I do now? I had all this experience running campaigns. I had a lot of experience organizing. I had a lot of contacts all over the country. And I sort of thought, what could I do to help be part of the change? And it was shortly thereafter that my state rep, Tony Thurmond, decided he would run for higher office and that this seat would be open. And I thought, well, there's going to be so much stuff done at the state level. The federal government, in my impression, under Donald Trump was going to be a disaster. And whatever I could do to help people at the state level would be, I think, an important, way to actually move the needle and help people. And so I dove into a 12-way contested primary race, my first time running for office. And it was intense. It was a lot. And also having been behind the scenes and then to go be the candidate, I thought, okay, this is all the things that I've been working with candidates on. This is like my time to the rubber's going to meet the road here, and I better have a well-organized campaign and all these things that I would advise candidates to do. But I enjoyed it. We had 239 house parties on that race. I was in a different living room every night. We mobilized about 800 volunteers. I knocked on 115,000 doors. I mean, it was exciting, and it was exciting to win and then go into the state legislature.
And so what is on your legislative agenda right now?
So I do a lot of work in housing. Housing is, the #1 issue, I think, facing a lot of our communities. The cost of housing impacts so many things. The racial inequities in housing is an important issue to deal with. So I've done a lot of both housing production bills since I've been in the legislature, as well as bills to help protect tenants. We're looking at an eviction crisis with COVID. We're putting in more relief for that, but it's still going to be an issue. We have to build more homes. That's a really important piece of this, and I'm enthusiastic about Berkeley and Oakland in my district. Berkeley just is allowing for multifamily housing. Oakland's pursuing that as well. But I do think we have to really fundamentally address, the racial inequities, the redlining that has created so many of our communities that have left communities of color out when it comes to home ownership. And that means building more homes. So I do a lot in that space. I'm also doing a lot in space around working families. I think one thing that this pandemic has really shined a bright spotlight on is the fact that we don't have fundamentally good policies in this country that help working families. And especially if you have children, it's very difficult.
Well, let's talk about that viral moment that caught the world's attention, in which you brought your second daughter as a newborn to the assembly floor. What went through your mind when you learned you couldn't vote remotely?
Well, we had just had an outbreak of COVID in the Senate, which we're obviously in the same building. And so I had asked to see if I could remote vote. I was, about 4.5 weeks post C-section. Was obviously nursing my daughter quite a bit, and we had put forth a remote voting policy in the legislature. And so I'd asked if I could do that, and at first I was told I could, and then I was told I couldn't because there was concern about maternity leave qualifying legally. And I had already told a lot of my colleagues that I would be there to vote on their bills because I thought I could remote vote. And so then I had to make the decision, like the weekend before, of do I stay at home and stay with my daughter and stay on maternity leave and not go vote, or do I go and vote, right? And we were voting on expanding paid leave, ironically enough. We were voting on eviction protections. We were voting on a number of really important bills that I felt it was really important for me to be there. My constituents hired me for a reason, so that I can show up and vote. And even though I'm 4 or 5 weeks post, delivery, I need to be there. So I then figured out, do I leave my daughter at home or do I bring her with me? And given the breastfeeding, I just felt like the easiest thing to do would be to bring her with me. And so that's what I decided to do.
And has there been a change to that policy since then?
No one's requested remote voting that I'm aware of, so I'm not sure. But I do think we need to fundamentally sort of rethink, the policies that we have, not just in the assembly, right, but in our companies all across this country. If you look at Europe, they have much more generous paid leave policies, much more affordable early childhood care, and this issue isn't just a women's issue. This impacts families across the board, and so I think that sort of viral moment where I'm on the floor with my, 4-week-old, it's almost midnight, I'm giving a sort of rushed speech about a housing bill. I think that struck a chord because so many people are feeling that same thing right now. And I heard from thousands of people across the country who said, I'm really struggling. This is hard. And I've heard it in my own district. And so my hope is that coming out of this, we'll have a really unique moment to actually invest in these kinds of policies, get through the inertia that forbids us from actually having these policies, and create more robust working family policies for all of our communities.
Let's talk about another topic, the environment. Specifically, on the night of the Chevron oil spill in the Bay, you said you were exploring proposing an increase in fines for pollution in state waterways. So have you been able to move forward with that proposal?
Yeah, so I've looked into that. We just passed an increase in fines bill last year. Senator Monique Limon did, and she's been a real champion on this. She represents the Santa Barbara area. Senator Scott Wiener also this year has an anti-fracking bill. So I've joined on as a co-author to his bill because I do think it's important we figure out how are we going to both hold our companies accountable when these things happen, but also move off of fossil fuels. We've got to do it. We've got to do it now. And I say this as a mom of 2 young kids, and I don't mean to be sort of hyperbolic about it, but when I look at their future and the world that we're leaving them and their children, it's incumbent upon us to make this change, and we don't have time anymore. Now, I think we have to do it in a way that's thoughtful. We have a lot of good, I represent refineries. Those are good union jobs. We have to make sure that we're working with the building trades and other labor unions to figure out ways that we have other pathways of employment as we move away from fossil fuels. So I do think that's an important piece of this. But I think we can do that. And I think we have to do that when you look at what's happening to our environment.
I know you've been active on social media about some of the Asian American violence that's been on the rise recently. Would you like to speak to this situation?
Sure. It's horrific. It's not okay. It's incumbent upon all of our leaders to stand up against this. It's important we create avenues for those that are experiencing this to report this. I know my colleagues, Al Martucci and David Chu, are working on a bill to create a 1-800 number to report hate crime. We also have to make sure that folks who are experiencing it, some of whom are undocumented, feel comfortable going to law enforcement to report that hate crime. And then, once they get reported, they have to get prosecuted. It's watching what is happening, seeing what's happening in Oakland, seeing what's happening across this country, what happened in Atlanta. It's not okay. And unfortunately, you had a president, Donald Trump, who I think, gave a platform for this kind of violence. How he called coronavirus the China virus. It's unconscionable to me. And so we have to do everything we can as elected officials, as community leaders, as just individuals in our society to speak out and to stand up against this. It's very critical. It's alarming. And I, work with my colleagues in the AAPI legislature to work alongside them to stand up against this.
All right. Assemblymember Buffy Wicks from Oakland, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
A colorful project to provide shelter for homeless youth in the East Bay has opened after 2 years of planning and construction. Tiny Homes Youth Empowerment Village occupies an acre near the Oakland Coliseum. The project hopes to give its young residents a sense of independence, safety, and ownership. And it's this week's look at something beautiful. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me on Twitter at Priya D. Clemens. And you can find more of our news coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. From all of us here at KQED Newsroom, thank you for joining us. Good night.